Today, a dollar feels almost invisible. You earn it, spend it, swipe it, and move on. It looks neutral, ordinary, settled. But there was a time when the meaning of a single American dollar was violent enough to split the country against itself. Not over taxes alone, not over trade alone, over what money actually was. Because money is never just money. It decides whose debts become heavier, whose labor is worth less, whose losses are absorbed quietly, and whose power hardens during crisis. In 19th century America, that question turned into a national fracture. Gold against silver, credit against production. The financial East against the farming and mining West. What looked like a debate about metal was really a struggle over who the country would protect. And once that struggle began, the dollar stopped being a coin. It became a weapon. To understand how this fracture began, we have to go back to the beginning of the Republic. Early America did not treat money as a floating promise issued from above. The founders had seen too much paper lose credibility too quickly. They knew what happened when governments claimed value by decree, then printed beyond restraint. Trust thinned, prices blurred, social order weakened. So the young United States tried to anchor money in something harder than policy and more durable than politics. Something people could weigh, test, and hold. That choice mattered, because once money is tied to a tangible standard, power is constrained differently. The state cannot redefine value quite so easily. Credit grows more slowly, debt behaves differently, and ordinary exchange rests, at least in theory, on something outside rhetoric. This was not just an economic design. It was a moral architecture of trust. That system had a name: Bimetallism. It sounds technical. It was not. It meant the American dollar was legally tied to two metals at once, silver and gold, not as symbols, as money. Silver moved more easily through ordinary life. Wages, local trade, smaller payments, daily exchange. Gold carried greater weight in larger settlements, reserves, and high-value transactions. Together, they gave the young republic a broader monetary base. More than that, they spread trust across different layers of the economy. This is the part that matters. Bimetallism was not just a minting arrangement. It was a social arrangement. It shaped who could transact, who could borrow, how value circulated, and how strain was distributed when pressure hit. Two metals meant one monetary order with two supports. And for a time, that gave America room to breathe. Then came 1873, and the change did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived disguised as procedure. The Coinage Act of 1873 moved through Congress with the dry language of revision, housekeeping, administrative order. On the surface, it looked technical, almost forgettable. But monetary history is often altered this way, not by drama first, but by structure. Buried inside the law was a decision that would reshape the Republic's financial foundation. The standard silver dollar was removed from the core of the system, not loudly, not symbolically, legally. That distinction mattered, because once silver lost its place inside the monetary order, the balance that had supported the dollar began to narrow. And when the base of money narrows, power does not remain evenly distributed. Credit tightens, debt hardens, trust shifts upward toward institutions strong enough to survive scarcity. What looked like a technical correction was, in fact, a a silent transfer of pressure. Once the standard silver dollar was pushed out of the monetary core, the old balance did not merely weaken, it changed shape. For generations, the American system had rested on two metals, two anchors, two ways of carrying trust through the economy. Now, one of those anchors was gone. And when one support disappears, the structure above it does not stay neutral. It leans. Gold did not simply remain. It began to dominate. More and more, it set the standard against which value would be measured, credit extended, and debts enforced. That shift sounds abstract. It was not. Because a narrower monetary base does not just change coins. It changes who can breathe inside the system. Money becomes harder, access becomes tighter, and the pressure of repayment falls more heavily on those farthest from finance. This was the deeper break. Silver was not only removed from mint policy, it was removed from the social contract that had once spread monetary pressure across a wider republic. So who benefited from harder money? Not everyone equally. A tighter system favored those closest to finance: lenders, bondholders, institutions built to survive scarcity, and men whose wealth lived in contracts rather than crops. When money grows dearer, repayment becomes more valuable. A debt owed yesterday returns with greater force tomorrow. That does not require a villain in every room, but it does create a system with a bias, and that bias has a direction. The Panic of 1873 did not erupt from one cause alone. Railroad speculation, fragile credit, overreach, financial contagion, all of it mattered. But history is not lived as a spreadsheet. It is lived as injury. And to millions of Americans already under pressure, the removal of silver became the clearest symbol of what had gone wrong. Not because every collapse began there, but because that decision seemed to reveal who the system was willing to protect and who it was willing to expose. Factories slowed, banks failed, work disappeared, prices weakened, debt did not. That is when a legal change turned into a moral wound. People began to feel that money itself had been tilted against them. What had looked like reform from above now felt like abandonment from above. And once that feeling takes hold, economic pain does not stay economic. It becomes political anger. By the late 19th century, the conflict no longer looked like a technical dispute inside treasury rooms. It looked like America splitting into two different economic worlds. On one side stood the debtors, farmers across the South and West, silver miners, small producers, people whose lives depended on prices holding up long enough to meet what they owed. On the other stood the creditors, banks, bondholders, industrial capital, and the financial Northeast, where stability meant something narrower, harder, and more protective of accumulated wealth. These groups did not just want different policies. They meant different things when they said good money. For a lender, good money held its value and returned stronger. For a farmer, good money had to circulate widely enough to keep land, labor, and crops from being crushed under fixed debt. So this was never only gold versus silver. It was contract versus harvest, balance sheet versus season, Wall Street versus the wider republic. And once a nation begins to define money through opposing social realities, monetary conflict stops being abstract. It becomes a struggle over whose America will survive. Out of that pressure, something larger began to form. Not just a complaint about money, a political language of survival. What we call populism did not rise here as an abstract theory. It rose from people who felt the monetary order closing around them, farmers watching prices fall, workers watching wages thin, communities watching credit retreat while obligations stayed fixed. They did not believe the system was merely failing. They believed it was choosing. Choosing whose pain would count as necessary. Choosing whose losses would be called discipline. That is when monetary policy stopped sounding remote. It entered town halls, newspapers, campaign stages, and everyday speech. Because once enough people feel that money has been organized against them, they do not just ask for relief. They ask who designed the rules, and whether the republic still belongs to them.
Does this republic still belong
This
to the people
was the
who
deeper
built it?
force behind the populist surge. Not envy, not ignorance. A widening conviction that the nation's financial order had become too narrow for the people expected to live under it. Then the movement found a voice. Not a banker, not a theorist. A politician, yes, but more than that, a vessel for accumulated anger. William Jennings Bryan did not invent the grievance. He recognized its shape, and he gave it language. What made Bryan dangerous to his opponents was not simply that he supported silver. It was that he refused to leave the argument inside economics. He dragged it into morality, class, and national identity. He made money sound personal. He made policy sound like judgment. Under Bryan, the struggle over metallic standards became a struggle over whose labor would be honored, whose debt would be made bearable, and whose suffering would be treated as the acceptable cost of order. That changed everything. Because once a monetary debate becomes a moral debate, it stops belonging to specialists. It belongs to crowds, to conventions, to elections, to the republic itself. Bryan was not just speaking about silver. He was asking whether the nation still recognized the people being crushed beneath its idea of sound money. Then came the moment when the entire conflict stopped sounding like policy and began to sound like judgment. Bryan's Cross of Gold speech did not persuade through technical precision alone. It struck deeper than that. It turned a dispute over metal into a language of sacrifice, burden, and moral accusation. Under his words, gold was no longer just a standard. It became an image of weight placed on living people, an image of labor pinned down, of debt made holier than survival. That was the turning point. Because once a monetary argument is translated into the language of suffering and justice, it no longer belongs to balance sheets. It enters memory. It enters identity. It enters the imagination of a nation. This was the emotional peak of the silver movement. The instant when money ceased to be discussed as mechanism and was seen instead as a question of who would be asked to bear the cost of order. And once that question is heard clearly enough, neutrality becomes very hard to believe. By 1896, the struggle could no longer be contained inside monetary theory. It had become an election about the future structure of the country. Bryan stood for the angry coalition below, farmers, laborers, silver interests, and debt-burdened communities who believed the existing order had grown too hard, too narrow, too indifferent to those forced to live inside it. McKinley stood for something different. Not cruelty, stability, credit confidence, industrial order. A dollar that would reassure capital, strengthen repayment, and signal discipline to the financial world. That is what made the election so important. It was not merely Bryan versus McKinley. It was two definitions of national survival. One asked whether money should bend enough to keep society breathing. The other asked whether money had to stay firm enough to keep the system trusted.
So the ballot became a referendum on value itself. Not only what money was worth, but whose pain the Republic was willing to call necessary in order to preserve that worth.
In the end, silver did not vanish all at once. There were compromises, purchases, concessions, temporary efforts to slow the tide, but none of them altered the deeper direction of power. By 1900, the Gold Standard Act closed the question formally. What had been argued for decades was now fixed in law. Gold had won. And with that victory, a door shut, not only on silver as a monetary rival, but on an older idea of how broadly monetary pressure might be shared across the Republic. The system chose a harder center, a narrower anchor, a more disciplined definition of trust. To some, that looked like maturity. To others, it looked like surrender. The final confirmation that national money would be organized first around financial confidence, and only afterward around social strain. That is why this moment matters. Because when gold won, it did not simply defeat silver. It confirmed which kind of stability the United States would protect and which kind of pain it was prepared to leave outside the door. And yet, this was not the end of the story. It only looked like an ending because the political fight over silver had been settled. The deeper transformation was still unfolding. Gold's victory did not simply choose one metal over another. It moved the dollar one step further into a new historical process, away from a broader metallic order and toward a system in which money would depend less on substance and more on structure. That change did not happen in a single leap. It came in stages. First, silver was narrowed. Then gold stood alone. And eventually, even gold itself would no longer be enough to hold the entire system in place. That is the larger arc. Not just the triumph of gold, but the gradual separation of money from the thing it once claimed to be. From weight, from metal, from physical restraint. And once money begins to detach from material limits, power changes shape again. Debt expands differently. States act differently. Crises spread differently. So the real legacy of this conflict was not simply who won in 1900. It was the road it opened to the modern dollar. Trusted, abstract, immense, and no longer anchored the way Americans once believed money should be. There was a time when the relationship between gold and silver was not left to daily speculation. It was defined, fixed in law. A ratio declared by the state, 16-1. That did not mean the system was simple, but it did mean that value still lived inside an older world where money was tied to weight, metal, and formal public definition. Today, that world is gone. Gold and silver still trade, but they trade as commodities inside a market that decides their relative worth from moment to moment. And that shift matters more than it first appears. Because when the state no longer defines the relation between monetary metals, it is not just changing a ratio. It is surrendering an older claim about what money is. Value moves outward, from law, from metal, from fixed public measure, into a wider and more fluid system of price discovery. That is a civilizational change, not just in finance, but in how a society understands trust itself. Because once value is no longer anchored the old way, stability becomes less tangible, more abstract, and far more dependent on systems people cannot hold in their hands. And that leaves us with the question that still echoes beneath the entire modern system. If removing just one monetary metal was enough to shake a nation, enough to deepen debt, divide regions, reorder power, and turn monetary policy into moral conflict, then what happens when money is cut loose from metal altogether? What happens when the final restraint is gone? When value no longer points back to weight, reserve, or physical limit, but to confidence alone, to institutions, to law, to balance sheets, to promises about promises. That is not a small change. It is a different civilization. Because once money becomes fully abstract, society does not stop depending on trust. It depends on it more. Debt can grow larger. States can intervene further. Crises can travel faster. And ordinary people are asked to believe in structures they cannot test the way earlier generations could test a coin in the hand. That is the deeper legacy of the forgotten war between gold and silver. Not nostalgia, not metal worship. A warning that every monetary order decides who carries uncertainty when trust is stretched to its limit. And our system still has not escaped that question. It has only made it harder to see.